In 2001, in Seattle, Washington, a man seemingly ordinary was arrested for the brutal murders of dozens of innocent women.
You are a loser, you're a coward, you are nobody, you're an animal.
Most of these women were vulnerable individuals, including sex workers trying to survive on the margins of society or runaways who had nowhere else to turn.
He created the perfect recipe for serial murder by picking victims who were prostitutes, who a lot of people didn't really care about, and some might not even be noticed that they'd gone missing.
Known as the most prolific serial murderer America had ever seen, his 19-year reign of terror left the area surrounding Seattle littered with corpses.
He enjoyed treating these women like trash and dumping their body like so much garbage once he'd used them and abused them.
A man who had spent over 30 years working at a body shop, a devoted family man, and someone who appeared to be a church-going citizen.
I couldn't believe it. I was just devastated and in shock, and I think I went into denial. I wasn't believing it.
Ridgway, a man with children of his own, seemed like any other law-abiding citizen. But behind this facade of normalcy lay a dark and twisted secret. The women he murdered were of all ages, young and old, and many were struggling to survive: sex workers, runaways, and those abandoned by society. They were brutally strangled, discarded like garbage, and often abused after death. Some were even mothers, trying to care for their families.
The one thing that I want you to know, I was that daughter at home, waiting for my mom to come home.
For years, Ridgway managed to evade capture, leaving no physical evidence that could definitively link him to these heinous crimes.
Rivers are very good places to dispose of bodies because they rot quite quickly. They have the water washing all the forensic evidence away. We found that when the police did start finding the bodies, that they were decomposed, which made it very difficult for the police to even identify many of the victims for some time.
Despite an extensive investigation, both the police and FBI were at a loss. One profiler, Mary Ellen O'Toole, worked tirelessly on Ridgway's case, attempting to extract confessions from him during long, grueling interrogations.
My strategy was to get him talking and to have him do most of the talking.
Despite hours of questioning, Ridgway remained tight-lipped, his demeanor cold and uncooperative.
I would also sit very close to him so that I could maybe touch his elbow and say, "Gary, tell me what it feels like."
However, in a desperate attempt to avoid the death penalty, Ridgway eventually struck a deal.
Started at an early age, but sex and hurting the woman.
And he loved being able to talk, finally, after all these years. And in doing so, he kind of walked us down the path of all of his murders. At one point, Gary referred to himself as something like the lean, mean killing machine.
He confessed to killing at least 71 women, making him the second most prolific serial killer in U.S.
Explain that process to me.
Let's say she's always in the car, driving down the road, so I whip out my ID, and with my ID would be I put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name. But on the opposite side was pictures. And a picture of my son. They would know I was a probably normal person.
But you were really using your son as part of your ruse.
As Ridgway's chilling confessions unfolded, a shocking truth emerged, one that forever changed the trajectory of the investigation. Authorities, including the FBI and local police, were stunned to learn how a seemingly devout, church-going family man had been methodically killing women from the early 1980s until his arrest in 2001.
He came across as being a very meek and mild, safe person. As a matter of fact, in one situation, he had his child in the car with him when he picked up a prostitute.
Ridgway revealed that his killing spree began in 1982, the same year authorities made a grim discovery: 5 corpses found in the same location along the Green River. This revelation traced back to an ordinary day for Robert Ainsworth, who was passing through the river as usual. That discovery not only marked the start of Ridgway's spree, but also the beginning of this haunting documentary. Robert Ainsworth climbed into his rubber raft and began his familiar journey south along the Green River, edging towards Seattle's city limits. This routine trip, however, would soon take a chilling turn. As he floated downstream, his gaze caught sight of a middle-aged, balding man standing motionless on the riverbank, while a younger man waited idly in a nearby pickup truck. Assuming the men were out for a casual day of fishing, Robert called out to the older man, asking if he had caught anything. The man's simple response noble-eyed the eerie undertones of what lay ahead. As chronicled in Smith and Cullen's The Search for the Green River Killer, the man on the bank turned the question back to Robert, asking if he had discovered anything. Robert's light-hearted reply, just this old single tree, marked the end of their brief exchange. Moments later, the two men drove off in the weathered pickup truck, leaving Robert to continue his serene journey downstream. Moments later, the tranquil scene shattered as Robert found himself engulfed by an air of death. Gazing into the crystal-clear waters, he was met with an unsettling sight, lifeless eyes staring back at him. A young black woman's face emerged beneath the surface, her lifeless form swaying gently with the current. Initially mistaking the figure for a mannequin, Robert reached for it with a pole. In his attempt to dislodge her from a rock, his raft capsized, plunging him into the icy water. It was only after falling into the river that Robert realized the horrifying truth: the figure wasn't a mannequin but a dead woman.
A man on the water in a boat, and he saw underneath the water what he thought was a mannequin. It wasn't a mannequin, it was a human being, and there were two of them there. Well, one of the victims in the water, her hand was just waving with the current of the water. And it was like, here I am, please help me. But of course it was too late.
Just as the shock set in, he spotted another body, this time a partially submerged black woman, her lifeless form eerily still in the current. Panicking, he swam frantically toward the riverbank where the truck had once been parked. Shaken and drenched, Robert collapsed onto the riverbank, paralyzed by the gruesome scene. Nearly 30 minutes passed before he spotted a man with two children riding bicycles. Desperately, he flagged them down, recounting his horrifying discovery and pleading with them to contact the police. A police officer arrived shortly after, questioning Robert about what he had seen. Skeptical yet cautious, the officer waded into the shallow river to inspect the ghostly form. Upon confirming the grim reality, he immediately radioed for backup. Reinforcements soon flooded the scene, and detectives cordoned off the area to begin their meticulous search for evidence. In the midst of their investigation, one detective stumbled upon an even more chilling discovery: a third body, this time of a partially clothed young girl. Unlike the first two victims, this young girl was discovered on a grassy patch, mere feet from where the other bodies lay submerged. The grim cause of death was immediately apparent: she had been asphyxiated, with a pair of blue pants cruelly knotted around her neck. Her body bore clear evidence of a struggle, with bruises marking her arms and legs.
When I got through having a climax with her, I jumped on her.
How much are you pulling on her neck?
I'm pulling really hard on her neck.
How?
Just like this.
What are you saying to her?
Don't fight, and I'll let you go. I'm feeling, I gotta kill her, I gotta kill her, I gotta kill her.
She was later identified as 16-year-old Opal Mills, and investigators believed she had been killed just 24 hours before her tragic discovery. Chief Medical Examiner Donald Ray, after a preliminary examination, confirmed that all three victims had died by strangulation. The two women found in the river were later identified as 31-year-old Marcia Chapman and 17-year-old Cynthia Hines. Both had endured unspeakable brutality. Pyramid-shaped rocks had been forced into their bodies, and additional stones held them submerged beneath the water's surface. Dr. Ray concluded that Chapman, a mother of two reported missing 2 weeks earlier, had been deceased for over a week, with her body showing advanced stages of decomposition. In contrast, Hines appeared to have been in the water for just a few days, her remains far less degraded. Tragically, these were not the only lives claimed along the Green River. Just days prior, another victim, identified as Deborah Bonner, had been discovered, her nude body was found slumped over a log, another grim addition to the river's deadly legacy. Bonner, like the others, had been strangled to death. Just a month earlier, Wendy Lee Caulfield, another young woman, was found floating lifeless in the Green River, her life also stolen by strangulation. Even earlier, 6 months prior, Caulfield's friend, Leanne Wilcox, had been discovered in an abandoned lot several miles from the river. While Wilcox's death was not attributed to the Green River killer, the chilling pattern was undeniable. Within just 6 months, 6 women's bodies had surfaced in or near the river.
We did not know this was only the beginning of a reign of terror, and we wouldn't know who was doing this for a very long time.
Detectives on the scene began to piece together a horrifying realization: a serial killer was at large. The urgency was clear. The killer had to be stopped before more lives were claimed. In response, King County authorities assembled a special task force to confront the Green River murders. As reported by the Seattle Times, this operation would become the largest police task force since the infamous Ted Bundy investigations nearly a decade prior. The team was spearheaded by Major Richard Kraske, head of the Criminal Investigation Division, and Detective Dave Reichert of the King County Major Crime Squad. To bolster their efforts, they enlisted renowned FBI profiler John Douglas and criminal investigator Bob Keppel, celebrated for his groundbreaking work on the Ted Bundy case 8 years prior. Despite their determination, the investigation faced immediate challenges. The sheer volume of incoming information overwhelmed the police force, leaving them ill-equipped to manage the deluge of evidence and leads. Vital data was misplaced, overlooked, or lost entirely in the chaos. The situation became so dire that volunteers were brought in to support the overwhelmed task force. As detectives delved deeper, they uncovered a troubling connection. Many of the victims knew one another and shared a common history of prostitution. Investigators focused their search on the area where the victims were known to work: the bustling Main Strip in Seattle, spanning South 139th Street to South 272nd Street.
This was the area that I was working in. This is the area where the bulk of the Green River victims were picked up from. And we would sit here and look, trying to identify who might be the suspect. We had very dedicated detectives who were determined to solve this case.
Conducting hundreds of interviews, they questioned local prostitutes, hoping to unearth leads or details about suspicious individuals. Despite investigators' efforts, many of the women were hesitant to cooperate, their deep mistrust of law enforcement hindering progress. However, a breakthrough came when one prostitute reported a man on the Strip who had referenced the Green River murders. Acting on this tip, the task force began hunting for the suspect. By August 20th, 1982, police detained a potential suspect in the Green River murders. However, the case against him quickly unraveled. There was no concrete evidence linking him to the crimes. With no choice, authorities released the man, and the desperate search for the killer pressed on. Other reports from local prostitutes soon captured the task force's attention, sparking suspicion they might be tied to the Green River murders. 2 separate women recounted chillingly similar encounters. A man driving a blue and white truck had abducted and attempted to kill them. One victim, 21-year-old Susan Widmark, recalled a harrowing encounter. She described how a middle-aged man in a blue and white truck solicited her services. Once inside, he pulled a pistol, pressing it to her head as he sped toward a remote road. There, he cut the engine and brutally assaulted her. After the attack, the man allowed Widmark to dress as he drove her away from the desolate area. During the drive, he chillingly referenced the recent Green River murders. With a gun still aimed at her, Widmark seized a fleeting moment of courage, escaping from the truck at a stoplight and fleeing for her life. Before the man sped off, Widmark managed to catch a glimpse of part of the truck's registration number. Another horrifyingly similar account surfaced from 15-year-old Deborah Estes, who filed a police report in late August 1982. She described how a man in a blue and white pickup truck had approached her on a highway, offering her a ride. Trusting the man's offer, Estes climbed into the truck. Moments later, her trust turned to terror as he drew a pistol and pointed it at her head. He violently assaulted her, forcing her into submission before abandoning her in the woods, handcuffed and alone, as he sped away. Estes managed to free herself and fled, desperately seeking help. Detectives, noticing a chilling pattern in the attacks, focused their efforts on tracking down the blue and white truck and its driver, hoping it might provide a crucial break in the Green River case. In September, the investigation led authorities to Charles Clinton Clark, a meat butcher driving a blue and white truck along Seattle's Main Strip. A background check revealed Clark owned 2 handguns, raising suspicions that he might be the predator they were desperately seeking. Investigators presented Clark's driver's license photo to both Widmark and Estes. Each woman unhesitatingly identified him as their attacker. Clark was promptly arrested, and his home and truck were thoroughly searched for evidence. During the search, police recovered 2 handguns matching the descriptions provided by the victims. Under interrogation, Clark confessed to the attacks, yet doubts lingered about whether he was the Green River killer, as his known pattern involved releasing his victims after the assaults. Further complicating the case, Clark had a verifiable alibi during the disappearances of several Green River victims. While Clark was being booked for the attacks on Widmark and Estes, tragedy struck again. 19-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan, over 8 months pregnant, vanished during a walk near the Western 6 Motel.
Bridget was the much-loved daughter of a Catholic family in Bellevue, a very rich suburb of Seattle. She skipped school a lot. She joined up with a boyfriend named Ray, and they were living in a cheap motel on Highway 99. She left. I think she was still possibly turning a few tricks, and she didn't come back. Her family was so upset because she was 8.5 months pregnant.
The Western 6 Motel, situated along the Strip, was a well-known hub for many of the prostitutes targeted by the Green River killer. Acting on a hunch, Detective Reichert began to suspect that the killer might be hiding in plain sight among the civilian volunteers assisting with the case. A 44-year-old unemployed taxi driver soon became the focus of the investigation and was subjected to intense police questioning. Detectives were particularly alarmed because, just 2 weeks before Meehan's disappearance, 2 16-year-old girls, Kazan Lee and Terry Renee Milligan, had vanished under similar circumstances. Both were known to have a history of prostitution. Authorities suspected that Lee and Milligan were also victims of the Green River killer. The taxi driver appeared to align closely with the psychological profile crafted by FBI profiler John Douglas. According to Douglas, the killer was likely a confident yet impulsive middle-aged man who revisited his crime scenes to mentally relive the horrors he had committed. Douglas theorized that the killer was intimately familiar with the area and possibly harbored deep-seated religious convictions. He also believed the murderer might display an unsettling interest in police work, potentially inserting himself into the investigation to stay informed or even to manipulate it. Throughout the winter of 1982, police kept the taxi driver under close surveillance. Despite his staunch denials of involvement, he eventually became their primary suspect. With no concrete evidence linking him to the murders aside from his connections to 5 of the victims, authorities arrested him on unrelated charges of unpaid parking tickets. On September 26, 1982, the case grew even darker when the decomposed remains of 17-year-old Giselle A. Lavorne were found. Missing for over 2 months, her nude body was discovered by a biker near abandoned houses south of the SeaTac International Airport. She had been strangled to death with a pair of men's black socks. Curiously, Lavorne's appearance had changed. She was blonde at the time of her disappearance, but her body was discovered with her hair dyed black. Although her remains were located away from the infamous Green River, investigators were convinced she, too, had fallen victim to the killer. Between September 1982 and April 1983, the nightmare deepened as approximately 14 girls vanished without a trace.
Were young, and some of them had troubled pasts, but all of them are somebody's daughter and somebody's sister.
A lot of the young girls had grown up in abusive homes, and that was why they were running away.
Among the missing were Mary Meehan, Deborah Estes, Denise Bush, Shawanda Summers, Shirley Sherrill, Rebecca Marrero, Colleen Brockman, Alma Smith, Dolores Williams, Gail Matthews, Andrea Childers, Sandra Gabbert, Kimi Kai Pitzer, and Marie Malvar. The majority of the victims, aged between 15 and 23, were known to work as prostitutes along the main strip.
Everybody assigned to that investigation was committed to solving it, committed to bringing this person to justice, because these were, somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's mother, and we cared about them. We cared about them like they were our own kids or our own family members, and we wanted to solve it.
The Green River Task Force soon turned its attention to a potential lead in the disappearance of the most recent victim, Marie Malvar. On April 30th, 1983, Marie Malvar's boyfriend witnessed her speaking with a potential client in a dark-colored truck while she solicited on the strip.
Maria Malvar, with her boyfriend, were at a restaurant on the highway. Her boyfriend went to make a phone call. When he came back, Maria wasn't in the restaurant. And he was very concerned, and he thought, well, I'll go out on the highway and see if I can find her. And he realized that Maria was in the truck ahead of him. There was a man driving, and then she was talking to the man. And so he determined to follow the truck because he wasn't sure what was going on. He worried about her. And they got up to the stoplight at Highway 99 and 216th. But when he turned left, he couldn't see the car.
Maria's boyfriend, already distressed by the recent disappearances of other young women in the area, became increasingly worried. Determined to find her, he enlisted Maria's family, and together they searched the streets for the pickup truck she had entered. Their search led them to a quiet cul-de-sac just a few blocks from the strip, where they found the truck parked outside the modest home of a local truck painter.
And they asked local police, please, to go there because they believed Maria was in that house. One of the sergeants did go there, knocked on the door, a man answered, and he said, there's nobody here but me. And they didn't press it.
A truck similar to Ridgway's was also linked to the disappearance of Kimi Kai Pitzer, a young prostitute who went missing in April. According to her pimp, Pitzer was last seen entering a dark green pickup truck with a camper attached. The driver, he recalled, had a pockmarked face. The pimp watched helplessly as the truck drove away, taking Pitzer with it. She was never seen again. While he reported the incident to police, investigators failed to connect her disappearance to Malvar's case. By spring 1983, the Green River Killer investigation was unraveling. Task Force detectives began to doubt the likelihood of the taxi driver being the murderer, yet he remained their primary suspect due to a lack of stronger leads. With no fresh leads, the killer continued his grim spree, and prostitutes vanished at an alarming rate. Overwhelmed by a flood of tips and evidence, the task force struggled to manage the sheer volume of information. Detectives turned to renowned investigator Bob Keppel for assistance in sorting through the overwhelming mountain of data. Beginning in late April, Keppel dedicated 3 months to meticulously reviewing every piece of information tied to the suspected Green River murders. After completing his exhaustive analysis, Keppel presented a detailed report to King County Sheriff Vern Thomas. To the dismay of the task force, the report delivered a harsh critique of their handling of the case. In his book, The Riverman, Keppel stressed that significant changes were imperative if the killer was to be caught. His report revealed that much of the evidence, files, and witness statements were in complete disarray, hampering progress at every turn. Keppel emphasized that the first critical step was a thorough reorganization and precise categorization of all available data. Only then could investigators analyze the cases for patterns identifying key similarities and differences that might link the murders to one or more suspects. Keppel's findings made it clear that a successful investigation would demand far more time and resources than initially anticipated. Already, the Green River investigation was the largest and most costly operation in the nation's history. Implementing Keppel's recommendations would push the budget well beyond the projected $2 million. Yet, despite the staggering cost, action was imperative to halt the killer's relentless spree. On May 8, 1983, the horror continued when the body of 21-year-old Carol Ann Christensen was discovered. Her remains were stumbled upon by a family foraging for mushrooms in a wooded area near Maple Valley. Christensen's body was staged in a grotesque display, further showcasing the killer's depravity. Her head was shrouded in a brown paper bag, and when it was removed, investigators found a fish deliberately placed atop her neck, a macabre and chilling signature. According to Smith and Gullen, the killer staged the body with grotesque precision. A second fish was placed on her left breast, a bottle positioned between her legs, and freshly ground beef set atop her left hand, which was folded across her stomach. A later examination confirmed she had been strangled with a cord. Oddly, evidence suggested that her body had been submerged in water at some point, despite the river being miles away. Investigators theorized she was yet another victim of the Green River killer.
Rivers are very good places to dispose of bodies because they rot quite quickly. They have the water washing all the forensic evidence away. We found that when the police did start finding the bodies.
Tragically, during the spring and summer of 1983, 9 more young women, most of them prostitutes, vanished without a trace. The missing women included Martina Arthur Lee, Cheryl Lee Wims, 18, Yvonne Antosh, 19, Carrie Royce, 15, Constance Neon, 21, Tammy Lillies, 16, Kelly McGinnis, 18, Tina Thompson, 22, and April Buttram, 17. Most were added to the ever-growing list of suspected Green River killer victims. However, some were excluded because their bodies were discovered beyond the known dumping sites associated with the killer. That summer brought more grim discoveries. In June, investigators found the unidentified remains of a young white woman, estimated to be between 17 and 19 years old, along Southwest Tualatin Road. On August 11th, the body of missing Shonda Summers was uncovered near SeaTac Airport. The very next day, another unidentified body was found at the SeaTac Airport North site. The fall and winter of 1983 proved equally harrowing, with disappearances escalating and more bodies unearthed.
Some of them were in the mountain foothills, some of them were down in the Green River Valley. There would be 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 in one spot.
Unbelievable.
And then again, between September and December, 9 women mysteriously disappeared, and 7 bodies were found suspected to be the work of the Green River killer. The missing women, primarily prostitutes, included Debbie Abernathy, 26, Tracy Ann Winston, 18, Patricia Osborne, Maureen Feeney, Mary Sue Bello, 25, Pammy A. Venti, 16, Delise Plaisir, 22, Kim Nelson, 26, and Lisa Lorraine Yates. Among the recovered bodies was 17-year-old Dolores Williams, who had disappeared on March 8, 1983, and whose remains were found on September 18th at Star Lake. On the same day, September 18th, the body of 23-year-old Gail Matthews was also uncovered at Star Lake. In the following months, 5 more women's remains surfaced. On October 15th, skeletal remains identified as 19-year-old Yvonne Antosh, who had last been seen on May 31st, were found near Seuss Creek along Auburn Black Diamond Road. Antosh was among the rare few victims with an active missing persons report. 12 days later, on October 27th, the partially buried remains of 21-year-old Constance Neon were discovered south of SeaTac Airport. Believing more victims lay undiscovered in the area, investigators organized a search with the help of a team of teenage explorer Boy Scouts. On October 29th, during a sweep of a vacant lot near the airport, one scout uncovered a skeleton hidden beneath a pile of trash and bushes. The remains were later identified as 22-year-old Kelly Ware. Before the year ended, the killer's rampage claimed 2 more victims. On November 13th, an extensive search of lots near South 192nd Street, south of SeaTac, led to the discovery of Mary Meehan's badly decomposed remains.
Bridget was the much-loved daughter of a Catholic family in Bellevue, a very rich suburb of Seattle. She skipped school a lot. She joined up with a boyfriend named Ray, and they were living in a cheap motel. on Highway 99. She left. I think she was still possibly turning a few tricks, and she didn't come back. Her family was so upset because she was 8.5 months pregnant.
Tragically, her unborn child was also among the grim findings. As noted by Cold Serial, Meehan and her child were the only victims of the Green River Killer to have been fully buried. Surrounding her remains, investigators uncovered puzzling items: small pieces of plastic, a clump of hair near the pubic area, a patch of skin with fibers still attached, 3 small bones, 2 broken yellow pencils, and clear plastic tubing.
To every serial killer, human beings are objects. There's no emotional connection. There's nothing there.
A month later, on December 15th, the skull of Kimika'i Pitzer was discovered near Mountain View Cemetery in Auburn, Washington. This site appeared to mark the killer's newest burial ground, the 5th known location used to dispose of his victims. Just 2 weeks after Pitzer's remains were found, the Green River Task Force expanded by more than 50% in response to the escalating murder toll. Fears mounted that the killing spree would intensify in the months ahead, a prediction that tragically proved accurate. At the time, the official count of Green River victims stood at 11 or 12. However, this figure has been, and continues to be, the subject of dispute. To this day, the true number remains unknown, with many believing it to be far higher than originally estimated. By late 1983, approximately 18 bodies had been discovered in the Seattle area. Strangely, several victims were excluded from the official list, despite being killed in a manner strikingly similar to the others. No explanation was provided for their exclusion. January 1984 saw a shift in the Green River Task Force's leadership. Captain Frank Adamson, formerly of the police department's Internal Affairs Unit, assumed command of the investigation. Adamson wasted no time implementing drastic changes. Early in his tenure, he relocated the task force headquarters to the Berrien County precinct, positioning it closer to the airport and the epicenter of the crimes. Acting on Keppel's advice, Adamson restructured the task force by delegating specific responsibilities to individual team members. This method aimed to streamline the organization and analysis of the overwhelming amount of information, increasing the likelihood of breakthroughs in the case. According to Smith and Gullen, Adamson formed a specialized team of 7 investigators led by a sergeant to focus solely on the victims of the Green River Killer. A second, similarly structured team was tasked with analyzing information related to potential suspects. 3 detectives were assigned to a newly established crime analysis section. Their responsibilities included following up on leads, identifying potential patterns and methods employed by the killer, and analyzing other critical details tied to the investigation. Adamson also reinforced the task force by assigning 22 officers to the proactive squad. Their mission was to implement strategies for monitoring prostitution activities along the Strip and identifying unusual behavior or interactions in the area. Keppel introduced a pivotal strategy shift. Investigators were instructed to focus not on proving a suspect's guilt, but rather on establishing their innocence. This approach enabled investigators to swiftly eliminate suspects with verifiable alibis, allowing them to direct their efforts toward individuals more likely connected to the crimes. Remaining suspects were categorized based on the degree of threat they posed. Individuals most closely linked to the victims or matching the killer's profile and movements were classified as Category A. Less compelling suspects were placed in Categories B or C and systematically ruled out. The newly restructured task force appeared poised to make progress, but the horrors continued. On February 14, 1984, skeletal remains identified as Denise Louise Plager were discovered 40 miles from Seattle near Interstate 90. She was the first victim found that year, but far from the last. In the following 2 months, the discovery of victims escalated, with approximately 9 bodies unearthed. Among the identified victims were Cheryl Wims, 18, Lisa Yates, 26, Debbie Abernathy, Terry Milligan, 16, Sandra Gabbert, 17, and Alma Smith, 22. The identities of several others remained unknown. Most of the victims shared a significant commonality: a history of prostitution. While the task force seemed to struggle in making concrete progress, emerging patterns helped them refine the killer's profile and gain deeper insights into his movements. The killer appeared to favor multiple dumping grounds for disposing of his victims. Apart from Mary Meehan, most of the bodies were found partially buried or concealed beneath garbage or dense foliage. Many of the bodies were uncovered along remote roads, often near illegal waste dumping sites. FBI profiler John Douglas theorized that the killer chose these locations deliberately, reflecting his dehumanizing perception of his victims as disposable human garbage. By 1983, the killer had shifted his dumping sites from the river to areas around SeaTac Airport and Star Lake. By 1984, remains were increasingly discovered near Mountain View Cemetery and North Bend, often in proximity to Interstate 90. Disappearances were heavily concentrated in two areas: Seattle's downtown core and the Strip. Investigators hypothesized that the killer either lived or worked near the locations where he was disposing of the bodies. When task force members plotted the dumping sites on a map, the locations formed a triangular pattern. This led investigators to believe the killer likely resided somewhere within this geographic zone. In April, investigators made a critical discovery near the skeletal remains of some victims. Hidden beneath the brush concealing the bodies, they found shoe impressions potentially left by the killer. Further analysis revealed the impressions were from a man's walking shoe, size 10 or 11. This crucial piece of evidence offered a tangible link between the killer and his victims. In mid-April, volunteer task force worker and self-proclaimed psychic Barbara Kubik Pattern reported having a vision of another victim's body located near Interstate 90. Frustrated by the police's lack of response, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Kubik Pattern, accompanied by her daughter, began searching for the body based on details from her vision. Their efforts led to the discovery of human remains. The two immediately drove to a nearby area where police were conducting a search. When Kubik Pattern informed an officer about her discovery, she was met with skepticism and even threatened with arrest for obstructing the search perimeter. Frustrated, she turned to reporters stationed nearby to share what she had found. Eventually, task force members approached her during her conversation with reporters and asked her to lead them to the body. What they found confirmed her claim a grisly discovery awaited them. The remains were identified as those of 36-year-old Amina Agashev, who had last been seen on July 7, 1982, at a restaurant in downtown Seattle. Unlike most of the Green River Killer's victims, Agashev didn't fit the usual profile. She was older, a waitress rather than a prostitute, and had been in a stable relationship. She was also a mother of two. Despite the differences in her lifestyle and the location of her body, investigators believed Agashev was another victim of the Green River Killer. Agashev was classified as one of the killer's earliest victims, despite evidence of other murders fitting his modus operandi that occurred before her disappearance. On May 26, two children playing along Javita Road in Pierce County stumbled upon a skeleton, a discovery that left them horrified. The police and task force were quickly notified. A medical examination later identified the remains as those of 15-year-old runaway Colleen Brockman. Despite the new discovery, investigators were no closer to identifying the killer, relying only on the mapped locations of bodies and a single shoe print as potential clues. Nearly 3 years into the investigation, the killing showed signs of slowing, but the task force's determination to capture the perpetrator remained unwavering. In August 1984, hope surged when two inmates in a San Francisco jail confessed to the Green River murders. However, after extensive interviews, investigators determined their claims were nothing more than an elaborate hoax. Months later, infamous serial killer Ted Bundy, from his death row prison cell, extended an unusual offer to help Keppel and the task force catch the Green River Killer. Bundy provided Keppel with a rare opportunity to delve into the mind of a serial killer and offer too valuable to decline. Their correspondence, conducted primarily through letters, allowed Keppel to pose detailed questions that Bundy answered with chilling insight. Bundy's responses intrigued Keppel and the task force, offering valuable perspectives. He theorized that the Green River Killer likely knew his victims, possibly even befriending them before leading them to their deaths. In The Riverman, Kemper detailed Bundy's suggestion that the killer may have disposed of additional bodies in the same areas where recent remains had been found. Bundy also believed the disposal patterns pointed toward the killer's home being nearby. Bundy offered a uniquely disturbing perspective that proved useful in understanding the behavior of serial killers. His insights helped detectives refine their approach to the case and gain a deeper understanding of the Green River Killer's mindset. Bundy became an unexpected yet significant contributor to the task force, working alongside experts like Douglas and Kemper to refine the killer's profile. Despite his unsettling insights, the task force remained no closer to identifying the Green River Killer. While the pace of murders appeared to slow, they did not stop entirely. Between October and December 1984, the bodies of two more victims, 25-year-old Mary Sue Bello and 18-year-old Martina Otherly, were discovered. Both women's remains were found near Highway 410, bringing the total known body count to 31. However, only 28 victims were officially included in the Green River murder list, while 14 more women remained missing and unaccounted for. On March 10, 1985, a partially buried body was unearthed near Star Lake Road. The remains were later identified as 15-year-old Carrie Ross, who had vanished in the summer of 1983. In mid-June, a man clearing land with a bulldozer in Tigard, Oregon, uncovered the skeletal remains of two more women. They were later identified as 23-year-old Denise Bush and 19-year-old Shirley Sherrill, both known to work as prostitutes in Seattle. The discovery of Bush and Sherrill's remains confirmed a chilling development. The Green River Killer's activity had expanded beyond state lines. Tigard appeared to serve as a new dumping ground. Amid these revelations, FBI profiler John Douglas reevaluated the case and proposed a startling new theory: the possibility of two separate killers. Douglas theorized that while the two killers shared strikingly similar profiles, their disposal methods diverged. Some bodies were carefully hidden, partially buried, or concealed in isolated areas, while others were left openly exposed, such as those found in the Green River. While plausible, Douglas's theory lacked concrete evidence or suspects to substantiate it. The case had grown cold, with no viable connections to any of the murders. As the investigation stretched beyond 3 years without resolution, public pressure on the task force intensified.
You know, the unfortunate thing is some of the women of the street felt like the sheriff's office wasn't investigating the case as hard as we could have because they were street kids and runaways, and that's not true.
Authorities were already under significant pressure from the public, and to make matters worse, the skeletal remains of 3 more victims were unearthed. The first discovery was identified as Mary West, whose skeletal remains were found in a wooded section of Seward Park in Seattle. The other remains belonged to Kimikai Pitzer and an unidentified white female estimated to be between 14 and 19 years old. A particularly unusual detail emerged in Pitzer's case: her remains were found in 2 separate locations. Her skull had been discovered in December 1983 at Mountain View Cemetery, while the rest of her body was located 2 years later in a nearby ravine. While it was possible that animals had moved the skull from the body post-mortem, investigators found no evidence to support this. Instead, they suspected this was another deliberate act by the killer. The motive for separating Pitzer's remains across 2 locations puzzled investigators. They speculated that the act was intended to either taunt law enforcement or deliberately mislead the investigation. In February 1986, the Green River Task Force appeared to receive the break they had long awaited. A man described as a person of interest was brought in for questioning and search by investigators. The incident attracted widespread media attention. An FBI agent, alongside Detective Jim Doyton from the task force, conducted extensive questioning of the suspect. It didn't take long for investigators to conclude that he wasn't the perpetrator. The man was subsequently released.
The killings appeared to have stopped. Many thought that he was gone.
It's incredibly unusual for a serial killer simply to stop killing. A serial killer will usually only cease murder when he's apprehended or when he dies himself.
Meanwhile, public frustration with the task force's lack of results continued to grow. Despite multiple suspects being detained over the years, none had any proven connection to the murders. Public outrage and fear reached a breaking point, with the media labeling the Green River Task Force a failure. Adding to the turmoil, the summer brought another grim discovery: the skeletal remains of 3 women found off Interstate 90, east of Seattle. The victims were identified as 19-year-old Maureen Feeney, 26-year-old Kim Nelson, and an unidentified young woman. Of the 3, only Feeney could be tied to a history of prostitution. The total number of victims edged closer to an astonishing 40. By late 1986, the task force staff had been slashed by 40%, and Captain Frank Adamson was reassigned. Leadership transitioned to Captain James Pompey, who quickly set about reorganizing the team and streamlining the investigation's massive trove of data. Before Pompey could fully implement his plans, December brought another chilling discovery: 2 bodies found far from the usual sites, in an area north of Vancouver, British Columbia. Once again, it seemed as though the killer was mocking investigators. More disturbingly, partial remains of several other women were found scattered near the 2 bodies. Despite the location's distance from previous dump sites, investigators were certain the killings bore the unmistakable signature of the Green River Killer. In early 1987, investigators turned their attention to a new suspect. Already known to police, the man had been apprehended in May 1984 for attempting to solicit an undercover officer posing as a prostitute. However, he was released after passing a lie detector test. A deeper dive into the man's history revealed a troubling incident from 1980. He had been accused of choking a prostitute near SeaTac International Airport. Claiming self-defense and alleging that the woman had bitten him, he was released from custody. Task Force Detective Matt Haney grew increasingly suspicious of the man and delved further into his background. Haney uncovered a 1982 incident where police had stopped and questioned the suspect after finding him in his truck with a prostitute. Haney discovered that the woman in the truck was Kelly McGinnis, later identified as one of the Green River Killer's victims. Further investigation revealed that in 1983, police had questioned the same man in connection with the disappearance of Marie Malvar. A key witness, Malvar's boyfriend, had followed the suspect's truck to his home after recognizing it as the vehicle his girlfriend had entered before disappearing. Haney began to believe he was closing in on the Green River Killer. Haney uncovered more damning evidence from the suspect's ex-wife, who revealed that he frequently visited the dump sites where many victims were found. Additionally, several prostitutes reported seeing a man matching his description routinely cruising the strip between 1982 and 1983. Investigators learned that the suspect drove through the strip almost daily on his commute to work. Most incriminating of all, records showed that this truck painter had been off-duty or absent during every instance of a victim's disappearance. On April 8, 1987, police secured a warrant to search the suspect's house. According to the Seattle Times, they also collected bodily samples to compare with forensic evidence recovered from Green River victims. Despite the search and collected evidence, there wasn't enough to make an arrest. The suspect, identified as Gary Ridgway, was released from custody. Weeks after Ridgway's release, tragedy struck the task force when Captain Pompey suffered a fatal heart attack during a scuba diving accident. The media quickly sensationalized the incident. Some media outlets even floated an unsubstantiated theory that the Green River Killer was a police officer and had orchestrated Pompey's death, a claim entirely unsupported by evidence. One newspaper went so far as to demand an official investigation into Pompey's death, reflecting the heightened tension and frayed nerves gripping the public after years of relentless murders. In June, under the leadership of Captain Greg Boyle, the task force was drawn back into action. 3 boys searching for aluminum cans stumbled upon partially buried skeletal remains. The remains were identified as 17-year-old Cindy Ann Smith. Her body was found in a ravine near Green River Community College 3 years after her disappearance. In the year that followed, additional remains of missing young women surfaced, including 14-year-old runaway Debbie Gonzalez and 15-year-old Deborah Estes, who had disappeared 6 years prior. Their deaths were attributed to the Green River Killer. While the discovery of bodies continued, there were no reports of new killings tied to the Green River Killer within the Seattle area. In 1988, the discovery of over 20 bodies of prostitutes in San Diego sparked speculation that the Green River Killer had relocated and resumed his deadly spree in California. Detective Reichert, along with new task force commander Bob Evans, collaborated with the San Diego Police Department in a joint effort to track down the elusive killer. In December 1988, investigators identified a new suspect, William J. Stevens. He came under scrutiny after multiple viewers of the popular crime show Crime Stoppers called in to report him as a potential lead. Stevens, a prison escapee, had been on the run for 8 years following a 2-year sentence for burglary. By the time police rediscovered him, he was a pharmacology student at the University of Washington. As investigators dug into Stevens' past, they found that he had already been a suspect in the Green River murders. He was also known for his outspoken contempt for prostitutes and had, on several occasions, talked openly about killing them. A search of Stevens' home revealed a disturbing cache of firearms, multiple driver's licenses, credit cards under assumed names, and explicit photographs of prostitutes. Stevens supported himself through extensive robbery and credit card fraud. Throughout the summer and fall of 1989, task force investigators interrogated him extensively about the Green River murders and conducted repeated searches of his home. Investigators expanded their search to include Stevens' father's home, but no evidence surfaced to connect him to the murders. Further investigation revealed a strong alibi. Credit card records and photographs from Stevens' brother placed him traveling across the country during the summer of 1982, when many of the murders took place. Ultimately, Stevens was cleared of any involvement in the Green River murders. In October 1989, 2 more sets of skeletal remains were discovered. One of the victims, Andrea Childers, was found in a vacant lot near Star Lake and 55th Avenue South. As with many previous victims, the cause of Childers' death remained undetermined due to the advanced state of decomposition. In early 1990, Denise Bush's skull was discovered in a wooded area of Southgate Park in Tukwila, Washington. The rest of her remains had been found 5 years earlier in Oregon. Once again, it appeared the killer had deliberately moved Bush's remains to different locations, seemingly to mislead investigators. As the case dragged on, task force members began to fear the killer had eluded them entirely. Morale among investigators plummeted to an all-time low. By July 1991, as reported by the Seattle Times, the task force had dwindled to a single investigator, Tom Jensen. After 9 years, nearly 49 victims, and $15 million spent, the task force had yet to catch the Green River Killer. The case was now infamously regarded as the nation's largest unsolved murder investigation. For a decade, the case remained dormant. In April 2001, nearly 20 years after the first known Green River murder, Detective Dave Reichert, now the King County Sheriff, reopened the investigation. Refusing to let the case fade into obscurity, Reichert was determined to finally bring the killer to justice. This time, technological advancements gave investigators an edge. Reichert assembled a new task force, starting with 6 members, including DNA and forensic experts, as well as seasoned detectives. The team quickly expanded to over 30 personnel. The team re-examined all evidence collected from the case, sending several forensic samples to modern laboratories for analysis. Among the first samples tested were those connected to 3 victims: Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, and Carol Christensen, all murdered between 1982 and 1983. The samples included semen believed to be from the killer. These underwent advanced DNA testing, a method unavailable during the original investigation, and were compared to samples collected from Gary Ridgway in 1987. On September 10, 2001, Reichert received the long-awaited news. DNA analysis confirmed a match between the semen samples from the victims and Gary Ridgway. The revelation brought the seasoned detective to tears. On November 30th, 2001, investigators intercepted Ridgway on his way home from work, arresting him on 4 counts of aggravated murder. The charges included the murders of 3 victims linked by DNA evidence and Cynthia Hines, whose death was tied to Ridgway through circumstantial evidence. After 20 years, the manhunt for the Green River Killer had finally ended with Ridgway in custody. This time, there would be no release. Ridgway, born in Salt Lake City, Utah, on February 18, 1949, was employed by a computer company at the time of his arrest. During the murders, Ridgway worked as a truck painter, a job he held for 30 years at the Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton, Washington. Ridgway owned several trucks over the years, one of which, a 1977 black Ford F-150, caught investigators' attention. According to Seattle's King 5 News, the vehicle was allegedly linked to several victims. As reported by Time magazine's Terry McCarthy, Ridgway exhibited an unusually high sexual appetite. His 3 ex-wives and several former girlfriends described him as sexually insatiable, often demanding intimacy multiple times a day.
He was very much into having sex, often, repeatedly, throughout the day, as frequently, pretty much, as women would agree.
They would go out in the truck, and he loved to have sex in public where they could be discovered at any time.
Ridgway frequently insisted on having sex in public spaces or wooded areas, including locations later identified as the sites where he dumped his victims' bodies. Ridgway's obsession with prostitutes bordered on a disturbing love-hate dynamic, fueling both his desires and his violent tendencies. This violent obsession may have taken root during his childhood, as he often accompanied his father on his county bus route.
Gary sometimes would ride with him on the bus, and his dad would say, see her, she's a prostitute, she's, the scum of the earth, and would berate prostitutes and talk about how filthy and bad they were. And then there are a couple of episodes where Gary recalls him leaving him in the vehicle while Dad went and had sex with a prostitute.
Neighbors recalled Ridgway's frequent complaints about prostitutes operating in his neighborhood, yet he routinely sought their services, creating a stark contradiction in his behavior. Ridgway appeared conflicted, torn between his overpowering lusts and his deep-seated religious convictions. According to McCarthy, one of Ridgway's ex-wives described him as a religious fanatic who often wept after sermons and spent hours reading the Bible.
When I first met him, I thought he was quite the gentleman and so polite and nice. He loved the country music and the dancing. And he was always smiling. He never got angry. And I just thought he was the greatest. It was like love at first sight.
As investigators continued collecting evidence linking Ridgway to the Green River murders, he maintained his innocence during preliminary hearings.
Up to this point, Gary had been maintaining that they had the wrong person, that he had had sex with many prostitutes, he hadn't killed any, and that was essentially going to be the defense.
However, authorities believed the mounting evidence would ultimately secure his conviction. Ridgway's attorney, Tom Savage, anticipated the trial would begin in 2004, with prosecutors planning to seek the death penalty. Meanwhile, Ridgway remained in custody, awaiting his fate. As the case captured global attention, one pressing question loomed: was Ridgway the sole perpetrator of the Green River killings? On November 5, 2003, Ridgway, then 54, avoided the death penalty in King County, Washington, by confessing to the murders of 48 women, the majority of whom he killed between 1982 and 1984.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1?
Guilty.
When he confessed, and when I sat and listened to him say guilty after every one of the names that they had said.
For the death of Mary B. Meehan.
Guilty.
I just sat there and cried, and that's when
Based
it
upon my observations,
finally sunk in that this is real. He did it. There's someone else inside of him. When he went through the door and left to go to work, he wasn't the man that I knew. I would think back and think about all those years that I was with him. Were they real? Or was he just using me?
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 48?
Guilty.
I lived with him all those years. He could have killed me. He could have killed my daughters. He could have killed my grandbabies.
Ridgway struck a deal with prosecutors, agreeing to cooperate in closing these cases in exchange for 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole. His formal sentencing took place in January 2004. However, because some victims were buried or potentially killed outside King County, including in Oregon, Ridgway still faced the possibility of the death penalty in other jurisdictions. Before Ridgway was led away, Judge Richard Jones ordered him to turn and face the families of his victims.
I don't wish for him to die. I wish for him to have a long, suffering, cruel death.
I can only hope someone gets the opportunity to choke you unconscious so you can live through the horror that you put our daughters, our sisters, our mothers through.
The one thing that I want you, Gary Ridgway, to know, I was that daughter at home, waiting for my mom to come home.
I think for all of us, as we brought the families up and introduced them, it was really emotional.
There are people here that hate you. I'm not one of them. What God says to do, and that's to forgive all. So you are forgiven, sir.
You took from me my firstborn child. May her soul and the soul of the other 47 victims rest in peace.
Having been led to believe prosecutors would pursue the death penalty, instead it was sacrificed in the plea bargain. Legal scholars questioned whether this case marked a turning point for the death penalty in Washington state. If a man who methodically murdered 48 women avoided execution, they asked, who could be deemed eligible? Ridgway exhibited classic psychopathic tendencies, showing no remorse and struggling to remember many of his victims. He never learned their names and dismissed them as disposable, viewing their murders as impersonal thrills. I killed some of them outside, Ridgway admitted. I remember leaving each woman's body in the place where she was found. I killed most of them in my house near Military Road and a lot in my truck, not far from where I picked them up. Ridgway insisted all his killings occurred in King County, likely hoping this would deter prosecutors from pursuing charges in other jurisdictions. Ridgway's deep-seated contempt for women, particularly prostitutes, was evident in his plea statement. I picked prostitutes as my victims because I hate most prostitutes, and I did not want to pay them for sex. I also picked prostitutes because they were easy to pick up without being noticed, he added. I knew they wouldn't be reported missing right away, some might never be reported at all. I chose prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without ever getting caught, Ridgway confessed with chilling candor. Ridgway displayed classic serial killer behavior, admitting that reliving the murders brought him a sense of control and power that he lacked in his daily life. He deliberately buried his victims in clusters, allowing him to revisit the sites and relive the gratification he derived from their murders. King County officials attempted to present the plea bargain as a form of closure for the case. However, for many, it felt far from over. There was skepticism surrounding Ridgway's claims. The timeline suggested he went on a killing spree from 1982 to 1984, stopped entirely, and then resurfaced with isolated murders in 1990 and 1998, an unusual pattern for a serial killer. This pattern defies typical serial killer behavior. While killers may slow down during periods of intense law enforcement activity, they rarely stop altogether. Is it plausible that Ridgway ceased killing after 1984, having murdered 46 women in just a few years? Many investigators suspect there are additional victims, buried both within and beyond King County, yet to be discovered. Uncovering the bodies that formed part of Ridgway's plea deal took years. Finding the others may take even longer. For many, the case feels far from over.